Hello, everyone. All right. Michael King says, hey, so I guess that means people can hear me, which is good. Right. Let us share the screen. All right. Let's just get this to the full screen thing. Where do we do that? Over here. All right. Okay. There we go. Move this over here. Okay, I think we'll just wait a few more minutes, see if a few more participants show up. Lots of people here. Let's see. Well, it's about time that we at least begin to begin. So I thought that what I would do today was begin with some discussion of our upcoming critical responses. And the reason is that I had sort of talked about maybe doing like a one-off video to explain how to do this, but I think it would be better if like a video that I would just upload to YouTube, for example. But I think it would be better to do it in a more interactive kind of way, where if any of you have questions about how to tackle one of these critical responses, you can just kind of put them to me as they strike you. And then, of course, I'll upload this lecture to my YouTube channel, so that anyone who is not here or who has missed part of the lecture can review it, and hopefully everybody will be in really good shape for their critical responses. So with that said, let's see, I have 7:37 as the time. I might wait just a couple of more minutes before we get started. So I'm just curious if anyone has any questions or remarks, comments, anything like that on anything that we've covered last week that may have struck you since last week. Okay, I'll take that as a no. I wonder how everybody found their foray or their initial foray into chapter 2. I quite enjoy what I've read of it so far.
Hello.
Hello.
I got to the basic emotions part. I didn't know how far in we were supposed to go. I felt like it was really interesting.
Yeah, I agree. I don't think we'll get quite that far today. But basic emotions are fun. The discussion of these goes all the way back to Darwin,
Um,
which is kind of cool.
I thought the secondary emotion thing was really cool too. How we feel about our emotions and then how that can play into how we self-monitor.
Yeah, like second order emotions and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, we'll definitely, well, if time permits, I hope we get that far today. Um,
All good.
a couple questions in the chat real quick. James is asking if there will be a rubric for the reading response. Not really, but I mean, I'm going to give you the scoop today. And we can spend as much time talking about the critical responses as everybody would like. Because I want you to all feel like you're going into this having some idea of what you're supposed to do, right? Hayden asks, has the spec for response one been released? Kind of, I mean, again, that's what I'm going to be covering today. PDF is acceptable, but I will, again, this is all stuff I'm going to cover today in more detail. Any other questions in the chat? Nope, not for now anyway. So, oh, wait, never mind. No problem, James. So I suppose we'll get started then. It's yeah, it's about 7:40 on my phone, 7:39. So let's get into it. Let's get rid of this. Okay. So yeah, critical responses. I want to make sure that everybody has a good idea and feels confident that they'll be able to write something good. Just taking a quick look at what's in the course outline, you have to do 4 of these throughout this course, and each one counts toward 10% of your final grade. Now, I think that the word limit I've set, this is kind of a loose guide, right? And when I set word limits in my classes, you know, with something this small, there is a sort of limited amount of wiggle room, like with an assignment this short, I mean. But 500 to 750 words, I would really try and stick somewhere in there for your final word count, which of course does not include your works cited page if you have a works cited page, and it does not include any of the student information. You can go a little bit over and a little bit under, but really the sweet spot would be somewhere in between 500 and 750 words. Maybe some between 500-600 is fine. Don't go substantially over or under, right? Because you're just not going to, there's just not going to be enough there for me to evaluate. Of course, you have to cite works properly, and probably the only thing for this first response that you'll actually need to cite will be the textbook or one of my lectures. But I'll talk a little bit about citation and how to do it correctly in a moment. The job of, well, your job, all of your jobs for this is to identify an interesting idea from one of the previous lectures and critically engage with it. And again, I'll say a little bit more about what I mean by that in a moment. And of course, I want you to submit them all in doc format. PDF is okay. But again, I'll say a little bit about this in a moment. So I don't have the submission portal up yet. I'll probably do that sometime tomorrow. I've got a few people who have asked me whether the submission portal is up, how can they submit? I don't see the submission portal yet, so on and so forth. I haven't got around to doing this yet. I will do it tomorrow at the latest. And it'll be as simple as uploading your stuff. I imagine all of you have used Brightspace before. We've all had at least the summer semester to get used to it. So there should be no problems there. James asked, what is the preferred citation format? I'll tell you in a moment. I actually don't have a preference, but there is a way I want you to kind of go about it. So I'll speak to that in a moment. So doc format is preferred. Oh, PDF says it's accessible. I mean, acceptable. PDF is acceptable if you cannot submit in doc format. But we're all Carleton students, or in my case, staff. We should actually all have access to Microsoft Office. 365, which you can access using your Carleton University credentials. It's been a little while since I've had to set this up myself, but basically you download Office, I think. You download it, and I think there are links to do this on Carleton University's website too. You download this and you log in with your My Carleton credentials, and you have access to Microsoft Office as well as like PowerPoints and Excel and everything. Not that you'll need those for this class, but you know, this is just a long way of saying you should all be able to access Microsoft Office and save your work in doc format. If you can't do that though, PDF is also acceptable. So those are the only two formats I want you to submit your work in. Anything else, I'm going to have trouble opening. And if I can't open it, I can't grade it, right? I will penalize late submissions unless there is a valid reason for lateness. I'm pretty flexible. I'm pretty accommodating, by the way, when it comes to this stuff. The usual acceptable reasons are things like illness or bereavement, but of course we're still in the middle of a pandemic, and the requirement of getting a doctor's note has been waived. So if you're sick, whether it's COVID-19 or not, hopefully it's not something worse, but in any case, if you're sick, don't feel like you need to go out of your way to get a medical note. You know, we're all on the honor system here. And if you tell me that you're ill and you cannot complete an assignment, I'll believe you and I'll work with you. Bereavement, of course, same thing. But also I will make exceptions for extracurricular stuff. Extracurricular stuff might include like a virtual conference you're participating in, or you know, anything like that. Or it could be something related to athletics, or although I don't know how much of that is going on this semester, but point is I'm being accommodating. And I also want to stress that when I'm talking about illness or bereavement, I'm also not talking strictly about physical illness. And this is another thing that's become very apparent that I've noticed more and more of during the pandemic with students in school, is there are a lot of mental health concerns as well. And I am very accommodating when it comes to that stuff too, because I know how it goes. So whether you're ill, you've got a flu or COVID or something, talk to me, we'll work out something else. If you're having extreme anxiety or something like that, talk to me, I'll accommodate you. Don't feel like you need to go get a doctor's note. Visit the doctor if you need help for any of your health issues, but don't feel like you have to get a medical note for any reason. Just come and talk to me. Oh yeah, plagiarism, right? Citations. This is where we want to talk about the citation style. It's very important that you cite work to avoid plagiarism. And this is all in the course outline, so I'm not going to go over all of the things that count as plagiarism in great detail, but you all know the basics. If you're quoting directly, there need to be quotation marks, page numbers, so on and so forth. You know, even if you're paraphrasing, you still have to cite the source that you're drawing the idea from. Don't submit work that you've submitted elsewhere in this class. You can take an idea maybe that you've developed in another class and continue developing it in some of your work here. But you can't just submit the same thing you submitted somewhere else. You have to develop it further. And if you have questions about that, I encourage you all to contact me. And of course, I don't care what citation style you use. I just care that whatever one you pick, you keep using it consistently throughout your work, right? Don't start with APA and then switch to MLA or Chicago halfway through. APA is probably probably a good one to use here, the American Psychological Association. You could use that in a class like this, but don't feel like you have to. Got a question in the chat, LOL. Yes. Yeah, I don't care. I really don't care. I just want you to be consistent. And there is a handy style guide here This is OWL, Purdue's OWL, their online writing lab. Yeah, I mean, it happens, believe it or not. Sometimes students will switch it up mid-paper. Yeah, Chicago is really more like if you're in a history class or something. That's the only time I've used Chicago. APA rules. Maybe MLA is okay if you're in an English class, but we're not. So, use whatever you want, but use this guide right here. It has all of the citation style guides: APA, MLA, Chicago, Harvard, IEEE. I think it's got everything on there. So if you're not sure how to cite something, you can find it there. I tend to get questions like this more in my classes, like my first and second year classes, but you really don't need to ask me how to cite things. This guide is exhaustive. So, I don't want to sound mean, but I shouldn't be receiving any emails asking me how to cite things. You can find all of this in this guide. And it's quite simple. It's very easily laid out. And of course, I'm going to make available tomorrow when I create the submission portal, I'm also going to make a template available. And it's very simple. It just has, title, student information, you fill all that in yourself, and then it shows the body where you can write your response, which needs to be 500 to 650 words, and then a references section. So it's very simple, and I'll upload that template in case people are not sure what their assignment should look like, right? So I'm just going to kick over to the chat in the video and just ask everybody, are there any questions so far before I get to explaining, this whole critical analysis thing and so on? Okay, straightforward so far, Isabella says. That's good. Okay, so let's get rid of the chat and this thingy. All right, so these critical responses, as the name suggests, your job is to conduct a little bit of critical analysis, right? And of course, what are we doing when we are critiquing something? I'll just put that question to all of you. Unsure, perhaps we're unsure. That's okay. Oh, no. Oh, there's some there. Yeah, we're evaluating it. That's right, James. We're evaluating it with a critical eye. As Chelsea says, we're assessing it, finding where we see strengths or weaknesses, and we're commenting on those. If we identify a weakness, we might want to explain why it's a weakness. If we identify a strength, why is that a strength in this argument or that argument? Are there reasons to doubt what claims are being made, or is there evidence to support these claims that is not being discussed, right? These are the kinds of things I need you to do. I need you to think critically about something that you find interesting. Drawing connections, yeah, Chelsea, that's correct. That's another good one. Robin says, I took Phil 3501 with you. Yeah, I remember, Robin. That was a fun class. I enjoyed teaching that one. Mindware. Okay, yes. Yeah, well, Robin is very correct to point out that, I do this kind of thing in all of my classes. And yes, if any of you were in my philosophy of cognitive science class, where we read Andy Clark's book Mindware, you were supposed to pick an interesting idea or claim and engage with it. I agree with it because, or I disagree with it because. Here's an alternative that works better. Here's some evidence that maybe isn't mentioned, but which we can bring to bear on this claim or this idea, right? So yeah, there will be, it's a similar kind of thing to what I'm expecting from that class. And just to go back a moment to Chelsea's Yeah, you're welcome. You're welcome, Robin. But just to go back to Chelsea's comment, drawing connections is important too. One thing that I really like to see is connections that are drawn between ideas in the text that maybe are not that apparent, but which you can establish with a little further analysis. Or, and this is a really good way to get a good mark, is to connect one of these ideas to something new, something maybe that we aren't covering in class, something that's beyond the scope of what we're doing here, but which is nonetheless still relevant potentially for our discussion. More in the chat. Yeah, I would say, so Hayden says it's less of an argumentative paper and more of an explorative paper. Yeah, I would think of it as very exploratory. There could be a little bit of argument though. I don't just want you to give me a survey like, oh, the idea of multi-track affective dispositions is cool. All right, why? Right? What does it help us do? How does it help us understand the emotions, right? That's what you need to tell me if you were to pick something like that. So I'll just go over the slide now, and then I'll take some more questions. So yeah, you want to choose something interesting, could be from the readings or from my lectures or from somewhere else that is relevant here. Critically engage with it by pointing out flaws, making suggestions for improvement. You can ask questions about the material and then answer those questions. There's a lot of things you can do in these critical responses. They're very open-ended in that way. But when you're writing them, be sure to think of them as like practice for researching and writing your final essay. And these are great, also for figuring out what you're actually interested in when it comes to this area. It's a big area of interest, the emotions. So what are you more interested in? Are you more interested in, the epistemology of emotions? Are you more interested in the phenomenology? Are you interested in how we study them? Like how do psychologists and cognitive scientists understand what they are? Are there connections between what we're doing in philosophy and connections elsewhere in psychology or neuroscience when it comes to emotions? And newsflash, there are, right? Philosophy is very fundamental, and it's something that we could characterize as almost like conceptual or pre-theoretical. It's something we do when, as Daniel Dennett says, philosophy is what we do when we don't know what questions to ask yet. So philosophy is fundamental. It's something that we should be doing before or concurrently with empirical work. So some of what we talk about here may have some implications for empirical research if you're more interested in that side of things, right? So alternatively, sometimes empirical research can have a bear on what philosophers talk about. I think all good philosophy should be empirically informed and empirically literate. So this is like a space to explore all of that, or explore questions that you think of as we go through the class. And of course, drawing connections between different ideas from within the materials we're covering or between these materials and elsewhere. So are there any questions in regards to any of that? Before I just give a last little bit of summary on, the kinds of things I'm expecting, like stylistically and technically, I mean. Yes, yes, you can. Yes, you can discuss topics with me, and the topics can be pretty open-ended, but they've got to have something to do with philosophy of emotion. Amanda raises her hand. Go ahead.
Yeah. Oh, perfect. I just had a quick question. I know some people, I don't know if the format, if you'd like a summary of the topic, like of the something interesting we're choosing, or would you want a little bit of like a paragraph or whatnot of a summary of that, or just just go right into the critically engaging with.
Definitely do a short paragraph that serves to outline the idea that you're going to talk about. Something that introduces it and explains what it is, because you want to assume that your reader is an intelligent but uninformed person, right? So pretend it's not me. You know, I know about the emotions, but pretend I'm someone else and I'm smart, but I don't know about the emotions. So you're going to say, oh, I'm going to talk about phenomenology. Okay, what is that? You know, just a few sentences. Explain phenomenology, explain what it is in the context of philosophy of emotions, and then critically engage with it, right? So yeah, that's a good idea to do that always. Okay, no problem. Any other questions before I try and mention everything that I might have forgotten to put in the slides? Okay, well, who wants to get an A+ on their assignment? Everybody. Yeah, totally. Yeah. Oh, we got a hand up. Go ahead. Or that was just to say I want an A+, probably. Okay. Well, if you want an A+, there's a few tricks that you can follow if you're in my class that will help you achieve an A+ on your assignment. By the way, I'm probably just going to straightforwardly grade these out of 100. So your letter grade will, you know, you can look up what that would be. Your number grade, you can see on the Carleton University grading scale what your number grade would be equivalent to letter grade wise. Yeah, I think actually before we dive into the material, I might like to brainstorm some general prompts with everybody. Would that be something that we'd like to do? Okay, definitely. Yeah, Gracie says yes. Robin, Amanda. Okay, totally. We'll do that for sure. I'll finish up my little blurb about how to get an A, and then we can brainstorm. So, how to get an A? You want to get an A or an A+. To get an A+, you've really got to not only deliver something that's like stylistically, technically, grammatically, it's got to be like perfect. So I don't want to see spelling mistakes, punctuation errors. Everything needs to be grammatical. That's an A or an A+ level paper. And how you get the A+ is you make a really interesting original point that perhaps has not occurred to me before, or you know an A+ is supposed to be, you know, a reflection of, you know, not only outstanding quality of your work, but also, you know, originality and the execution. So it's hard to get an A+, you know, I'll just say that it's hard to get an A+, but you can still get an A or an A+ if you, if you do a really good job technically on everything. And a nice way to do that, it's all about your editing stage. You'll want to read this paper aloud to yourself, because when you're proofreading and looking for those structural problems, and I tend to come down pretty hard on this stuff because, you know, we're in university now. We all should know how to not write run-on sentences or sentence fragments. We should all understand parallelism. We should all know how to use our semicolons correctly, although, you know, I don't know, even in university, no one seems to know what they're doing with semicolons. So make sure all of that stuff, all the technical side of things, has to be good. And, you know, you can edit it on your computer screen, just staring at your screen, editing it using spell check, which surprisingly not a lot of people actually do. You can do that, and that's helpful. But if you print it out and read your response aloud, you will be surprised just how many errors you will catch by doing that. Another thing to do is remember that the dictionary and the thesaurus are your friends. You want to write in a way that's not like all jargon, if you know what I mean. Sometimes people, they think, oh, I'm in a philosophy class, I need like big long sentences with big long words in them. You don't actually. You want to keep things simple. Simple and clear is best. So, you know, if you're going to use a big fancy word, or if you're going to use technical terms, you need to make sure you're using them correctly. Yes, phenomenology. Like phenomenology is a big fancy word, but once you know what it means, you know, it's not that bad. But imagine if you used phenomenology wrong, right? I mean, emotions have phenomenology, which means they have standards of justification and correctness. Well, right away, wrong, buzzer. You've used the wrong term, right? People do this a lot with like, you know, my favorite example is begging the question. People, that's a technical term. We're in philosophy. Begging the question is a technical term. People will say things like, you know, the emotions are affective states, but there are many affective states, which begs the question, what separates the emotions from other affective states? This is not how you use begging the question. Begging the question is a technical term that refers to a kind of circular argument, right? Where you're going in a circle. The Cartesian circle is my favorite example of begging the question. For the philosophers in the room, and this is cool. I agree. A lot of people get this wrong, and if you correct them, they accuse you of being a pedant. But it's like, no, this is philosophy. So begging the question, or petitio principii, names an informal fallacy. Where it's like this, where, you know, Rene Descartes, he's meditating, he's doing his meditations, right? Philosophers know all about the meditations, right? We got some philosophers who have read the meditations. Yeah. So Descartes trying to establish what he can know with certainty, and he's doubting everything. You know, I think, therefore I am. And he's building his epistemology back up from this foundation that is the cogito, I think, therefore I am. And he wants to establish a couple things. He wants to be able to say that he can trust his clear and distinct ideas, right? Clear and distinct ideas. They're clear and distinct under the natural light of reason to the intellect, which makes them trustworthy. Well, how does he know he can trust his clear and distinct ideas? Well, he's already worked out. God is not a deceiver, right? He's got an evil genius, or God. He could manipulate Descartes into believing that 2 + 2 = 5, but God's not a deceiver. So Descartes can trust his clear and distinct ideas. But Descartes also wants to say, I know that there is a God who is not a deceiver. What does he appeal to? His clear and distinct ideas of God. So it's a circle. You see the Cartesian circle, right? Like, how do I know God exists? I have a clear and distinct idea. How can you trust your clear and distinct ideas? Oh, God, right? It's a circle. So that is begging the question. That is an example of begging the question. So I don't want to see anybody saying, oh, this begs the question, unless you're actually pointing out an instance of that fallacy of begging the question, right? Another one is like concept, right? The concept of this, the concept of that. In philosophy, and in psychology and cognitive science for that matter, concept is a technical term, right? Concepts are mental items. They're like the building blocks of thought. They're also sometimes called categories or schemas. But people will use, you know, the concept of emotion is baffling. And it's like, hang on. In a philosophy paper, my concept of emotion is a mental item that allows me to think about and reason about emotions. It's a technical term, right? So you have to make sure you're using these correctly. And of course, there's other things, grammatical concerns, you know, make sure you know the difference between less and fewer, the difference between then and than, or the difference between there, and there, right? Grammatical stuff. Yeah. So you've got to be technically good, good, say something original and thoughtful, and not make any mistakes with your technical terms, and you'll probably get an A or an A+. But if you make these mistakes, it suffers. The clarity of your writing suffers, and that can affect your grade. Of course, the depth of your analysis, you know, try and go narrow and deep with these rather than broad and shallow, if you know what I mean. Pick one narrow thing and go and explore it deeply. Do not pick a broad range of topics and just, give me a summary of the first chapter. Don't do that. You'll get like a B- or a C, because you're not telling me anything. You're not critically engaging. So no summary. There's a little bit of summary in anything good that you do in your academic work, but don't, don't just be like, here's the emotions, phenomenology, epistemology, and intentionality. There you go. That's not a critical response, right? So yeah, James, find that helpful. Glad to help. Any other questions? And then we'll do a little bit of brainstorming, and then we'll wow, it's already 10 after 8. We'll do a little bit of brainstorming and then get on to the rest of the material here, because it's really not that difficult. Okay, questions. So I have an idea. There doesn't seem to be any questions so far, but I have an idea that may help you all come up with a good topic. There are many emotions, and we're starting to learn how to understand the emotions, in this class, how to differentiate them from other psychological states and affective states. And in this chapter, we're starting to learn how to differentiate the emotions from other emotions, right? And this is important because, there's a difference between happiness and sadness and anger that makes each of these emotions what they are and makes them have distinct phenomenological and epistemological and intentional profiles, we could say. And then we've mentioned new emotions. We all basic ones have been coming up in the text so far, like surprise, anger, joy. But then we've also brought up other emotions that maybe are like complex emotions, like cringe. We've mentioned cringe a couple of times. So I thought one cool idea would be like, if you came up with an emotion that you want to know more about, maybe let's say cringe. You want to know more about cringe. Okay, so what you want to do is try and characterize cringe using, say, for example, the epistemology, phenomenology, and intentional stuff we discussed in the first chapter. Give me a psycho-behavioral profile of cringe and explain why the profile you come up with is a good description of that emotion. That's one idea. And you can do this with any emotion. I kind of did something like this in my master's thesis, which, I know you're not going to be writing anything that long, not anytime soon, but I talked a lot about the emotion of eeriness. I argued that eeriness is an emotion. I didn't quite do it in the same way that Deonna and Teroni talk about emotions in their book, but I was struck by how eeriness, a sense of eeriness, is it comes up a lot in human robot interaction research, like the uncanny valley, like that kind of thing. And everyone's like, what is the uncanny valley phenomenon? Why are robots creepy? Why do they make us feel eerie? No one had asked what eeriness is. Is it even an emotion? Right? So that's what I did. You could get a start at doing something like that in one of these critical responses. So, does anyone think that might be an interesting approach for them to take? Backwards. Good. What are some other approaches that maybe some of you are thinking of taking? I can let you know whether they're good ideas or good approaches, or whether I would steer clear of them. I gather that a lot of people will probably adopt the approach that I've just described, but don't feel like you have to. Chelsea is going to say something in 1 sec.
Hi, I had
Hello.
to go get I printed out some of the reading and I had to go get it. I just moved to the kitchen.
No worries.
I guess I'm not really sharing what I think I'm necessarily going to write about, or what I'm going to write about, but something I did write earlier while I was reading this. There's a spot where they talk about um, how when we don't experience emotion, like sometimes we are experiencing the emotion, but one of the ways that we're unconscious, one of the ways that emotions can be unconscious. And I'm a psych student, and so I've been looking at some abnormal psych stuff. And I was just wondering, if we could look at it as sometimes our emotional responses or the way that we don't feel our emotions can be adaptive for survival, and um, how that might how we might come to know our emotions the further we get from that threat to our survival. So in the case of an emotionally damaging relationship, sometimes people don't see how bad something is until they're out of it. And then
Right.
how the maybe I'm going to use this word right. We'll see, the phenomenology of it develops over time. Maybe we end up feeling the emotion gets stronger, or maybe it warps into a different emotion, something like that. I don't know.
I think that's a pretty good idea, actually, because it's an example of what I mentioned earlier of choosing something that's quite narrow, right? Emotion, unconscious emotions. That's, it's not like broad, it's narrow, and you're going maybe specifically into, here's an example. If this emotion, can we call this emotion unconscious? If it's in a situation like that you're describing.
Mm-hmm.
That is another thing that you can do, absolutely, because it fits that narrow and deep approach, which is the better of the two. You don't want to go like broad and shallow, because that's just a literature review, right?
Well, and that's, I had been thinking, I know I had mentioned last time the anxiety and the ennui thing when we were talking about emotion and mood, and that's something that I still kind of have to suss out a little bit, because I feel like it's really broad right now, and I don't understand enough about what we're talking about yet to really explore it. So maybe later, but yeah, cool, thanks.
Yeah, I think that would be, that great. I mean, and that could be something that you come back to in a future critical response or an essay, right? So that's fine. Don't feel like you have to squeeze everything in, right? Like everybody, because you're going to run out of room. Don't hand me in a 1,200 page critical response, right? I'll dock marks for it. It's too long. So Gracie asks, what about the idea of pain as an emotion? Pain can be caused by physical things, and we bleed, but we can also feel pain in our heart and stomach from events like seeing something sad. Pain can be comorbid with other emotions like sadness. Well, I would be careful, because you don't want to equivocate between physical pain, which is definitely not an emotion, and emotional pain, which could be any number of different kinds of emotions or a combination thereof, right? So and this is an interesting idea. This is a way to do that critique. I mean, some people, if you we started the book this way, right? What are the emotions? Well, the first thing that comes to mind is feelings. Pain is a feeling, right? Is pain an emotion? Physical pain, I would argue, is not, in the same way that hunger is not an emotion. But yes, I think there really is something to emotional pain. Heartbreak, right? Heartbreak is like an emotional pain, right? It's there in the word, like my heart is broken, right? That sounds painful, or if somebody does something to you and you feel that sinking feeling in your gut, I would say that definitely counts as a kind of pain, but it's an emotional sort of pain. And there are a lot of ways you could cash that out. So that is a good idea, but be aware of the distinction between emotional pain and physical pain. Another one from where'd it go? Okay, so Hayden asks, I'm interested. Where'd it go? Epistemology of emotions, unjustified emotions resonate with me. Interesting. I mean, it's okay if you can't go like super deep. I mean, yeah, this one this one you could probably, it would probably be okay to be a little broad, but not like super broad, because you're going to want to come up with examples of, maybe I'd say 2 or 3 different examples of unjustified emotions and how you can bring this to bear on your discussion, right? Does that make sense? I hope that makes sense. Emotions and needs, how emotions work as motivations. So emotions as conative states, basically. Yeah, okay. Oh, it's a response to Gracie. Yeah. I would say, yeah. I mean, like when to bring it back to anxiety, which I don't know is a type of emotional pain, but it's a type of fright, right? And we don't like to experience it. It doesn't feel good. So like I was discussing in the previous lecture, if I feel anxiety, that can actually be a motivational state. If I'm anxious about class tonight, well, I better get to work and make my slides and do the readings and get ready to go, right? So yeah, conation, yeah, frickin' Latin, man. Conatus, that's what it comes from. Okay, I'm sure I missed some questions here. Explaining those emotions as it relates to epistemology. Okay, so to go back to the unjustified emotions, yeah, you might want to spell out some examples to show, where an emotion might be justified versus not justified. This is what the testimony example was about, right? Like if I receive news from a reliable source and it causes me to feel a certain emotion, and that emotion is correct, but I've also, it's been elicited by, some testimony, then that's accurate, then my emotional response is justified. If anyone's not sure about this justification, I would go on the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy and I would look up the justified true belief account of knowledge. And then, you can see what justification is all about. And it's pretty much the same thing when it comes to emotions, right? Is my emotional response justified? Like if somebody tells me I won the lottery, like if the lottery commissioner calls me and says, Josh, you won the lottery, and I get excited, that's justified because I've got the information. It's true. I've won the lottery and that information has come from a reliable source. But if I win the lottery and the guy who tells me is, Crazy Joe, who likes to pull my leg all the time, even if I have actually won the lottery, if it's Joe's unreliable testimony that causes my excitement, then my emotion is correct, but it's not justified, right? So that's the epistemological stuff that it relates to. No worries, no worries, no worries. La 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 la. Okay, I guess, geez, what time is it? We should probably get moving here. Does everyone find this helpful though? Like I just want you to feel prepared. I'm just hoping that you all feel a bit more prepared now. Excellent. Okay, good. You're welcome, everybody. I'm happy to do this. I want everyone to do well. All right, awesome. Everybody's good. Okay, my pleasure. Now, let's do some further philosophy on the emotions. Okay, diversity and unity of the emotions, part 1. I hope we get through all of this today, but if we don't, no big deal. We'll try and squeeze everything in on Thursday. So, as I mentioned, in chapter 1, Deonna and Teroni are all about, establishing distinctions between, oh my goodness, I'm so sleepy. Establishing distinctions between emotions and other kinds of states. These could be other affective states or psychological states. And this is why they look at the phenomenology, the intentionality, and the epistemology of emotions, but also some of the things that distinguish emotions from other affective states. So they distinguish between emotional episodes and emotional dispositions, affective dispositions, sentiments. Affective dispositions would include things like sentiments or character traits, depending on whether they're single or multi-track, right? So By doing all of this, we can differentiate between emotions and other psychological affective states. In chapter 2, we're interested, along with the authors, in trying to distinguish the emotions from one another, right? What distinctions can we draw within the category emotion? How do we differentiate between anger and happiness and sadness and disgust and all of this stuff? Oh, excuse me, I'm very sleepy today. Well, there are a few ways that we can go about doing this. One is that we can distinguish between positive and negative emotions, and we can also distinguish between conscious and unconscious emotions. But as we'll see, neither of these approaches are without problems, right? So let's start with positive and negative emotions, right? It seems that intuitively to be the case that some emotions are negative, whereas others are positive. And oftentimes, psychologists talk about this in terms of, oh, excuse me, I can't stop yawning. They talk about this in terms of valence or polarity. I tend to see valence more in the literature. You can say valence or valence, doesn't matter. I tend to see it valence more. So I use valence, but you can use polarity if you want to, if you think that sounds cool. So when we're talking about the valence of emotion, we're talking about, positive and negative. Is an emotion positively valenced or negatively valenced? Intuitively, again, some emotions seem positively valenced and others negatively valenced. Happiness definitely seems like a positively valenced emotion, whereas anger or perhaps sadness seems negatively valenced. I wonder if we can come up with any other examples of valence. Let's see, just choose an emotion, any emotion, and tell me if you think it is positive or negatively valenced. So Robin says jealousy is negative. Definitely. Intuitively, that seems quite true. Yes, absolutely. Michael says despair is negative. Absolutely. I would agree with that. And yeah, Narmeen says guilt is negative, is a negative valence. I would agree with that. Guilt is negatively valenced. Hope intuitively seems to be positive. Eagerness, maybe. I wonder, I'm just, maybe, it's a good, yeah. It depends what, I think for eagerness, the valence would depend on the object of the emotion, the particular object, and am I eager to do something that I'm also anticipating? Like, take that trip to the North Pole, or am I eager to get something over with? I have a big test. I'm eager to just get it over with, right? Maybe that's negative. What else? Playfulness. Playfulness seems to be maybe an emotion, but also maybe a behavioral characteristic. But I would say that it's positive, certainly. Excitement. I would say excitement. Again, yeah, probably positive, but I would want to know the object, the particular object. Robin mentions empathy. Now, empathy is tricky because empathy is not an emotion in its own right. Empathy is what we might call an emotional resonance phenomena, where I come to feel what you're feeling, right? Or I feel something for you. And there's lots of different kinds of empathy, right? There's regular old empathy, where I try and put myself in your shoes. There's sympathy, where I feel something for you, but it's not necessarily the emotion that you're feeling, right? If you're feeling sad and I sympathize with you, I might not feel sad myself, but I probably feel compassion for you. So that's sympathy. And emotional contagion too, is also a type of like proto-empathy maybe. So empathy is really complicated because it's not actually an emotion in its own right. Yeah, empathy is pretty far out. Actually, I think I have some books. One moment. little just a little plug here. So I got this book because I was the indexer on this book. This is cool. It's backwards, but it says Empathy and Morality. This is by Heidi Maybaum. Heidi was my yeah, Heidi. Oh, do you know her? Yeah. Yeah, Heidi Heidi was great. Heidi, she's at the University of Cincinnati now, but her area, I mean, well, actually, if she were still here, she would be teaching this class. I'm 100% certain about that. Oh, it's not backwards to you, only to me. Oh, weird. Well, that's good. So Heidi is at the University of Cincinnati now, but she used to be at Carleton. She does work on empathy and morality, as you can see here. And she talks a lot about psychopathy as well. That's pretty cool. And she was my supervisor. So, full disclosure, she supervised my master's degree when I talked about eeriness and the uncanny valley phenomenon. So this is a really great book. If you're interested in empathy and morality, later we're going to talk about moral emotions. Empathy may have a role to play in morality. And actually, the first chapter of this book is called Almost Everything You Wanted to Know About Empathy. And it's really a good primer on, what empathy is. And I think you can find this chapter online if you look for it. So very good. And if you're interested in something a little bit more far out, I got this social robots book. And let's see. Oh, it's been a while since I've opened this. You can probably find this. This is some really far out stuff. My goodness. It's been forever since I've looked at this, but oh, there's a really interesting chapter, Making Sense of Empathy with Social Robots. Cool. Oh, who wrote it? It was I. So if you want to know about empathy for non-human entities like robots, this is like essay topic stuff. Pick my brain, please. Pick my brain about it because it's very cool. It's a very cool area. Yes, Star Trek vibes. That's right, Kelsey. It is interesting, Narmeen. Correct. I love sci-fi. It's probably why I'm a philosopher and a scientist. Watching the crew of the Enterprise, Star Trekking along out in space, right? So empathy. Sorry for my little spiel about empathy, but I'll tell you some more stuff about empathy as we go. And if anyone wants to know more, I can probably point you in the direction of some good resources. So yeah, I think we've got a pretty good understanding of valence, but there's actually a couple of different ways that we can understand valence. What is positive and what is negative? What is positive and negative? If an emotion is positive, what's positive about it? We can understand positivity or negativity in terms of hedonic tone, for example. So we'll call that the hedonic approach. Remember, this is hedonic tone is hedone, pleasure. Emotions are pleasurable or displeasurable. That's one way to do it. We can also do it in conative terms. Conative states are motivational, right? Desires, wishes, any kind of motivation. These are all conative states. Conative, comes from the Latin conatus, which means like a blind striving or like a willing. Like if you read Schopenhauer or Nietzsche and how they talk about will, that's very much a conative state as well for any historically inclined philosophy people in the class. So we can take one of those approaches and we'll examine each of them in turn. What about the hedonic approach? Well, the authors state, and I quote, the hedonic approach has it that the various kinds of emotions are to be classed as positive or negative in virtue of what it is like to experience them, end quote. So this highlights a sort of really intimate connection between, hedonic tone and phenomenology. The hedonic tone is part and parcel of phenomenology. of the what it's likeness of emotions, right? And if we take the hedonic approach, what we're doing is really reducing each emotion to either a kind of displeasure or pleasure. They are other things too. Emotions might have specific eliciting conditions and action tendencies and so on and so forth. But each emotion is fundamentally just a kind of pleasure or displeasure, right? So we're treating pleasure and displeasure as irreducible phenomenal qualities. It's not like we can break pleasure down into something simpler, right? It's pleasure or displeasure. Things feel good or they don't. They feel bad or they feel neutral. But we can't really reduce pleasure or displeasure down any further. They're fundamentally irreducible phenomenal qualities. Now, I mentioned a moment ago, there are emotions which might be hedonically ambivalent or neutral as types of emotions, as categories of emotions. But on this approach, or on what we might characterize a strong version of this approach, each type of emotion has some hedonic quality, either positive, negative, or neutral. Question here. This can fluctuate between people. I would say yes, probably. What's a good example? Well, some people like hate exercise, right? But some people love it. Some people find it pleasurable to smoke a cigarette. Others find it disgusting, right? Sometimes, and this is an extreme example, sometimes people take pleasure in pain. I'm not talking about like sick, like sadists and masochists, like serial killers and stuff, but you know, like maybe in like the kink community, right? There are people who take pleasure in you know, being whipped, perhaps. Tattoos too, yeah, tattoos. I don't have any tattoos, so I don't know, but some people, I guess, get maybe like a tattoo high, because when we are in pain, the body releases endorphins, right? And endorphins are actually endogenous opioids. So the reason why opioids, morphine and heroin and so forth, have an effect on our psychological state is because they lock on to the same receptor sites as endorphins. So endorphins promote pleasure and mitigate pain. So perhaps that's why. Another question. Could we categorize emotions evolutionarily? Yes, we absolutely could. And that's what Richard Lazarus does in his book, Emotion and Adaptation. It's an evolutionary theory of emotions for sure. And I don't think that we can, I mean, I'm a naturalist. I'm a thoroughgoing naturalist. The mind evolved, emotions evolved. They evolved to do something, right? So an evolutionary understanding would be very revealing, I think, about what emotions are for. And we can still do other things with them, right? We're no longer hunting and gathering, most of us. So we probably rely less on our fear response for survival, but we can sort of vicariously experience fear by watching a horror movie, and that's fun, right? So yeah, totally. But I imagine we'll come back to this later on in the class. Okay, so where was I? Oh yes, each type of emotion, positive, negative, neutral, has an hedonic quality on the strong reading of the hedonic approach. But there's a problem. The problem? Surprise. No, I'm not literally surprising you. I'm saying that surprise, the emotion surprise, actually poses a bit of a problem here. So surprise, the authors claim, can be itself positive or negative or neutral. That's right, James. This is a problem for the hedonic view. The emotion of surprise poses a problem for the strong characterization of the hedonic view, at least. Why is it a problem? Well, if we're taking the strong approach and we're trying to use hedonic tone to say that surprise is a type of emotion. Remember, on the strong approach, we're saying there are different types of emotions: positive ones, negative ones, and neutral ones. But surprise, we can have positive surprise, negative surprise, or neutral surprise. So we can't say that surprise is a positive type of emotion, because I could experience surprise and it could be negatively, it could have a negative hedonic tone. You know, if I walked into my apartment and saw a dead body on the floor, for example, you know, that would be surprising and shocking, but in a negative way. If, on the other hand, somebody threw a surprise party for me, well, I mean, who am I kidding? That would also be negative. But, you know, say, for example's sake, I'm someone who likes surprise parties, well, then that would be positive surprise, right? Or maybe I'm surprised but indifferent to something. You know, like the election results. I'm actually not that surprised of the recent election results, but say that I were, I might be indifferent toward them because, you know, the House of Parliament doesn't look that much different than it did before Election Day, right? So maybe we can do a weaker version of the hedonic approach, and we could claim that there are not positive and negative types of emotion, but there are positive and negative episodes of emotions. So I could speak of surprise. You know, each particular episode of surprise might be balanced in, say, positive, negative, or neutral ways. Of course, neutral episodes of surprise would still seem to pose a problem here. And the reason is that we're trying to use hedonic tone to say either that there are positive and negative types of emotions or positive and negatively valenced episodes of emotions. But hedonic neutrality, you know, if something doesn't feel pleasurable or displeasurable, that's not a hedonic tone in itself. That's just an absence of hedonic tone. So we can't have neutral. If we're using hedonic tone, we can't really have a category of neutral, the authors claim, because neutral just isn't a hedonic tone. And we're trying to use hedonic tone to categorize either types or episodes of emotion as either positive or negative. There may even be more serious problems here for this approach than those that are raised by surprise. So, you know, if we turn our attention toward the phenomenology of different emotions besides surprise, we can ask ourselves, is it even at all clear that some of these emotions are fundamentally pleasurable or displeasurable? So, you know, again, intuitively, right, joy would seem to be a kind of pleasure and sadness a kind of displeasure. But there are other examples where this is not quite clear cut. Like, what about anger or pity? Are anger or pity pleasurable or displeasurable? I'm not sure. I think it probably varies. I'm curious if anyone has any thoughts. I think there are probably people who, like myself, I don't like getting angry. It doesn't feel good, you know? Yeah, like we don't get stoked about being angry. At least I don't. I don't like to be angry. Yeah, Robin, that's correct. I do believe they mentioned this, and I've mentioned it in lectures previously too. If people have anger issues, anger, you know, they might see as the only outlet they have for, you know, whatever reason, and it might even feel good to have a release. You know, even if it's not a healthy way of doing it, it might feel good to somebody with an anger problem. And then once they get it out of their system, they go back to not being angry anymore, right? I actually, you know, I don't like, I'll say this, this is really confusing because, okay, well, actually, I'll answer this point here in the chat. Could that be the same for grief or sadness? Like you need to feel it to feel good. Yeah, but the emotion itself, like you need to, if you have a loss, grief and sadness is normal. It would be weird if you didn't experience it. But while you're going through it, it doesn't feel good. but when you've processed your grief, you feel better. So, but that's not grief itself, right? But this is so tricky, you know. It also probably depends on the context. Yeah, Nadia, exactly. I agree with this. The actual episode of grief doesn't feel good, but it can lead to perhaps a better mood after you've processed your grief, right? But to bring it back to anger, this is tricky. Like, I used to work customer service, and I definitely encountered people that I think liked getting angry and lording it over me, you know, if I screwed up their order or something, right? Yeah. I mean, it's 2021. We all know of the existence of the Karen, right? Yes. and apologies if I have any people named Karen in the class, but the Karens, quote unquote Karens, I think they like getting angry. And I can't watch these Karen videos, right? I'm not sure. It could be because they want to provoke a response. But I don't know. I don't have access into the Karen mindset, you know, because I've been on the other end of it, and it's just like, why are you getting so angry? You know, so that's, I guess, one example. But the other example is, I used to take a kickboxing class back in the day when I was an undergrad, and I wouldn't really get angry, but you know, things I were that would be in the back of my mind that were maybe frustrating me or that I was upset about would kind of come to the forefront when I'm doing drills on the heavy bag or something. And you know, I'm punching and punching, and I'm not a violent guy, but just, you know, punching out your troubles with a bag for an hour and a half feels pretty good. So, you know, I don't know. I want to allow for there to be instances where anger may actually be seen as pleasurable. And that just, the point is just to say that it's not straightforward all the time whether emotions really are reducible to pleasure or displeasure, right? One may feel anger is the correct response. Yes. And this is really good. Anger can be a moral emotion, because anger, you know, if you're like Lazarus, anger is indicates, you know, an offense against you or against people you care about, right? Which is why Karens get angry, you know. The Karen, righteous anger. So and sometimes righteous anger is healthy, right? Like, if you've seen, and I know there's lots of people on the internet that would disagree with me, but if you've seen, like, you know, somebody like Greta Thunberg talking about the climate, she does seem a little angry sometimes, right? Which is like righteous anger. She's upset because, you know, young people have to deal with this climate crisis that was created by previous generations who did not care, right? We've known about this. We've known about the dangers of the greenhouse effect and CO2 since just after the Industrial Revolution. There are newspaper articles about it going back to the early 1900s. So it's not like we didn't know. Yeah, it's true. It's true. It was observed that coal produces smog and fog, and we were learning about the greenhouse properties of carbon dioxide and carbon monoxide. So yeah, we've known. And I think Greta Thunberg has a right to be righteously angry, shall we say. But then you flip it around and you look at a Karen, right, who's angry because maybe she has to put a mask on to go to Costco. That is very much a misapplication of anger, I would argue. I would say that it is neither correct nor justified, to use the language of chapter 1, right? That's another thing you could do for a critical response, an analysis of Karens or something. Is their anger justified? Somebody could probably have a lot of fun with that. An addictive quality to the adrenaline experience in the body. Yeah, I mean, that maybe that's why some people develop anger problems. I'm not sure, because I'm not a psychologist, but that sounds plausible, and perhaps we should explore it. So let me try, and I don't know if we're going to finish all this, but I'm going to try and look at problems, further problems. We have these problems for the what approach was I talking about? For the hedonic approach. But what about the conative approach? Well, the authors say that there's actually multiple ways that we can cash out the conative approach when it comes to valence. I'll just read from what I have quoted here. We can cash it out in one of three ways. We can cash it out in terms of A, motivational tendencies, where positive emotions are those that involve attraction to the object of the emotion, and negative emotions feature a kind of aversion toward it. Here I'm thinking of something like disgust. Disgust is a negative emotion in the conative sense, perhaps because things that we are disgusted by, we want to avoid, right? And things that involve attraction, we want to be closer. I mean, like if you have a crush on somebody, you want to be around them, right? If you have this infatuation, you want to be around them. But if you're disgusted by something, you want to get away from it. So that's one way we can cash out positive and negative valence in terms of a conative approach. Another way we can do it is in terms of desires concerning the mental state in which one's find oneself. This is from Jesse Prince. So when it comes to positive emotions, you want the intentional state you're in to continue. But if it's negative emotions, maybe you want it to stop, although that may not be true. I mean, Karens seem to like getting angry, right? Or finally, we can cash it out in terms of frustration or satisfaction of desires. So positive emotions would be those that reveal that a given situation is congruent with a goal, right? Feeling happy that you've finished your assignment, for example. Negative emotions reveal an incongruence. If you felt crappy because you didn't turn in your first critical response on time, for example. So there are multiple ways that we can cash this out. And Deonna and Teroni actually don't spend a whole lot of time talking about the conative approach here. They will revisit it later in the book, but I don't think that they think that this approach is any less susceptible to criticism than the hedonic approach. We saw a range of criticisms we can level against the hedonic approach. We'll probably see a similar range of criticisms we can level against the conative approach as we make our way through the text. Another distinction is conscious and unconscious emotions. Now, we only have 5 minutes left, unfortunately, so let's see how far we can get. One objection that we can raise against the hedonic approach, just to go back to the hedonic approach, is made clear or made apparent by a contrast we can draw between emotions that are consciously felt and those that are perhaps unconscious. And if you accept that there are unconscious emotions, then you have to ask, does it really make sense to try and understand emotions by appealing to phenomenal qualities such as hedonic tone? The assumption being that, if there are unconscious emotions, they are not felt, right? So we can't really understand them, in terms of valence, positive or negative, in terms of hedonic tone, if there are unfelt emotions. Are there unconscious emotions? Depends who you ask, right? One thing the authors talk about at length is Freud. I kind of like Freud. He gets a bit of a bad rep. Certainly a lot of the stuff he talks about is wrong and unscientific, but he is nonetheless an important figure because he's one of those figures who really raised awareness of the fact that so much of our mental life is driven by unconscious drives, desires, and emotions, right? And although psychoanalysis has been criticized as somewhat pseudoscientific, I think that Freud was absolutely correct to point out, contra Aristotle, we are not the rational animal. We have all kinds of unconscious drives and desires affecting our behavior that we're not even aware of. So whether you take like a strict Freudian reading of that or not, I take kind of like what I would call a loose reading of Freud, where he gets the broad strokes right, but the particulars are a bit wrong. He certainly seems correct that there are unconscious drives and desires that affect our behavior. I guess what I'm saying, like, I don't think that anyone is suffering from the Oedipus complex, right? I don't think that particular unconscious drive is real. However, there are unconscious drives, right? So that, does that make sense? I think so. I think that should clarify things for everyone. Also, some emotions are, like other body states, can be unfelt. Think, for example, if you're running, like if I'm going for a jog, I might twist my ankle, injure my leg, but maybe I don't feel the pain until I get home, or if I'm competing, maybe I'm running a race, but I don't feel any pain until I cross the finish line. Maybe there's a parallel with emotions. I might be behaving angrily, but I might not realize it because my attention is on something else. And it's not until somebody points out the way I'm behaving that I realize I'm in the grips of anger, right? So also, one other way we could think of emotions as being unconscious. So these are two ways right here. A third way is that, emotions occur, and what co-occurs with them, or perhaps a better way to say is how they are neurologically realized or implemented, is that there are certain neural centers that are activated in specific ways when we have an emotional response, right? So maybe a psychologist would consider an emotion to be unconscious if, say, a brain scan revealed the right kind of activity in the absence of a self-report about that kind of emotion, or in the absence of the right kind of like conscious behavior from her patient. So those are three ways of being unconscious, right? And we can kind of carve these up with different examples, right? An emotion might be unconscious simply because my attention is not directed at that thing, like my anger in the previous example. Or maybe something is unconscious, my emotion is unconscious insofar as it is not viewed as falling under any particular concept. So the example of the person who feels guilt, but it's an unconscious guilt in the text, and he spoils his other children because he feels guilty about the death of his daughter. And this is something that therapy would address. And even though psychoanalysis, Freudian psychoanalysis, is not the dominant therapeutic paradigm, a lot of types of therapy, like dialectical therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, are very heavily influenced by the approaches that Freud actually took in psychoanalyzing people, right? Maybe something is unconscious insofar as it's some kind of multi-track affective disposition, like a sentiment or a character trait. That's another way that it could be unconscious. But whatever the case, there are lots of different ways that we can understand an emotion as being unconscious. But Deonna and Teroni are quite clear that they do not think there's any inconsistency in asserting that there are unconscious emotions in any one of these senses that we've discussed, and between holding on to the idea that emotions are essentially felt. So even if we think, what that means is, even if we, tend to think of emotions as things which essentially have a felt quality to them, a phenomenology, there's no problem with the prospect of there being unconscious emotions either. They don't think that's a problem. There are other distinctions that we can draw. However, we have run out of time. So I'm going to finish this last slide next time when we finish the rest of the chapter. So if everybody's got to start heading out, that's cool. But if anyone has any questions, I will answer them quickly before I say goodbye.
I unsurprisingly have one more question.
Go ahead.
Okay. I was just thinking about it while you were talking about the unconscious emotions. And this is stuff that, again, I'm discussing in other classes too. So I'm just thinking about this all the time. This is all I think about. If we're not able to name the emotion, because we talk about emotion as it's subjective, but there is an objective part to it, right?
I think
Uh,
so.
right? There's a lot to discuss, I think, just unpack there. But
Yeah.
if we're operating under that assumption, if we're not able to articulate the emotion, so I'm really interested in how our language ability plays into therapy efficacy, I guess we could
Ah,
say.
okay.
um, how like education with people who don't have a first language, I'm really involved in. Okay, doesn't really matter. Anyways, if we can't name the emotion, does it become a different emotion, something more ambiguous until we can name it? Because
Hmm.
like it
Um,
could warp, would it warp into something that's more, maybe more stressful, or something else, or does that just become a different emotion? I don't know if that's really a question for you to answer. I'm just thinking
yeah,
about it.
it's a good question. Certainly, I mean, Andy Clark is a philosopher who's argued that language works as a kind of cognitive scaffolding, or really as
Okay.
a kind of cognitive technology, because language allows us to adopt more complicated concepts, like second order,
Right, yeah,
third order concepts, right?
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Now, and if you look at the way children develop, and this is not my area, so don't quote me on any of this, but I'm just thinking like the way children develop, their emotional complexity
Mhm.
increases as they age. It increases, and their linguistic competence increases too, right? And of
Mhm.
course, their knowledge, the concepts that they have. You know, children are like sponges; they suck up all
Mhm.
these words and concepts. Um, so, you know, if you talk to a kid about how they're feeling, you know, they're gonna say, "I'm happy," "I'm sad," "I'm
Mhm.
angry." You
Yeah.
know, it's
Mhm.
simple. But the older we get and the more we develop, we we probably become aware uh, that our emotional lives are more complicated. They get more complicated as we develop, and we notice they get more complicated as we get older and smarter and perhaps
Right.
more introspective. And then language gives us the tools to talk about it, but perhaps even the cognitive technology to have really complicated emotions like
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Schadenfreude or cringe or romantic love, right?
Mhm.
So,
Mhm. Okay,
yeah,
that's so cool. How do you spell Andy Clark? How do you spell that person's name? Is it just
I'll spell
ANDYCLA?
it. Yeah, I think it's this. I'll spell it in the chat. I think he's actually cited in chapter 2.
Okay.
But he has a
Okay.
really interesting book called Mindware. I'll put that there.
Oh, is that what you were talking about earlier in the class?
Yeah, that's the textbook I used for philosophy of cognitive science. And it's
Yeah.
really good. It's really good. I'd recommend anything written by Clark.
Okay.
He's just great. Really cool. Really cool stuff.
Cool. Thank you so much, Professor.
No problem.
Professor,
Yes.
I wanted to ask about the idea of like a repressed emotion in relation to like unconscious emotion. Like when we talk about like grief, but the inability to express it at a certain point, is that unconscious or do we recognize that we're not able to feel it yet?
I would say it's if it this is tricky because well, the example that the authors use is of course a very Freudian one
Mhm.
where, you know, a guy has guilt but he represses it. But,
Okay.
you know, if you're a Freudian, you're going to claim, well, okay, he's repressing it, it's in the unconscious, but the repressed returns, right? It
So,
return. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
oh no, sorry. I was just saying like the way I'm like thinking of it now is like when like something like traumatic happens, like say like you lose a person
Yeah.
and then you know like that you are upset but you can't feel that you are upset, like you know what I mean, like you're in a state of shock, and so even though you can fully process the fact that you're like, okay, I'm very upset about this, there's no way that you can actually emote it, like it's, you
Yeah.
look perfectly fine even though everything in your brain is telling you that you're not, like it's,
Yeah.
is
And
that still unconscious or is that realized?
I would say I'm giving you the Freudian answer, and
Okay.
I think that would be that if something is repressed into the unconscious, and I'm not saying that this is actually a good theory about how the mind works, but
Okay.
if something is repressed into the unconscious for a Freudian, the repressed always returns. It
Yeah.
returns in neuroses, anxieties, and imagery in your dreams, in
Mhm.
fears. So that's why you do psychoanalysis, to try to shine a light on it, right?
Okay.
Um, until you do that, I would say, yes, it is unconscious. But,
Okay.
you know, it's clear that you know, we may have mental mechanisms to defend against this. And maybe it's not quite like what Freud thought, but it's similar. You know, I was reading, or rather listening to, it was a guy who was talking about, he was a really high up firefighter in New York on 9/11. And he was telling about how he's like, I wish I'd been there. I wasn't there for my guys, for the firefighters who were there when the towers went down. And his coworkers are like, what are you talking about? You were there, you did this, you did that. He forgot, he lost time, basically.
He blocked out periods of time.
He blocked out periods of that day because it was so traumatic. And that would be another way of characterizing it as unconscious, those feelings.
Okay.
Right. So yeah, and this happens all the time in PTSD, right?
Yeah, for sure.
So yeah, I would say there are many ways. I guess I'm just trying to say in a really roundabout way, there are many ways to say that an emotion is unconscious. So if you're going to talk about it, you know, we just like, say you do a critical response, you just want to be clear what sense you're using the word, right?
Okay, thank you so much.
No problem. And there's a question in the chat from Rowan. Let's see. I will answer your question. Quick question. We're allowed to refer to ourselves. Oh, yeah. Yes, of course. This is a great question. I can't believe I didn't address this. Yeah, high school conditioning. I bet in high school they said, don't use the first person pronoun I, or you're writing a bad essay, finger wag. But that, frankly, pardon my language, is bullshit. Philosophers use the first person pronoun all the time. You know, there are certain styles where the style guide, like in Chicago, they'll recommend you not use I because they say it's redundant because you have your name on the title page or whatever. But for philosophy, you know, you're the rational mind who's making this argument. You are thinking, you are presenting the argument. You can absolutely say I. You can also use we if you want to sound fancy. You can use the royal we. Like, we will argue that there are no unconscious emotions, blah, blah, blah. You can do that. You can say this author, or you can say this paper, any way you want. But I like I is fine. You know, just say I'm going to argue blah, 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 or I will do this. 100% fine with me. Excellent. Good. I'm glad that's helpful. All right. Well, there's only a handful of people here. And I guess unless there are no more questions, I think I will take off and acquire dinner. Oh, no problem. Thank you all for sticking around. These extra questions are helpful, especially if people miss the lecture and they go and watch it later. They get all this extra info. So thank you guys. Whoops. What am I doing here? All right. Good night, everyone. And I'll see you for our next class.